September 1944. Geneva. A rain-soaked messenger produces a battered parcel at the gates of the International Red Cross. Inside are two things: a dossier stamped urgent in block German type, and a letter, unsigned but written with the desperate slant of someone who no longer believes they will survive. The documents inside are clinical. Lists of names, places, and categorical notations. Vollständig sterilisiert. Fully sterilized. Across the channel in London, an American OSS analyst scans the headlines and sees a buried line: emigration restrictions, reduced family birth rates, and operations in Silesia, disease or design. In Washington, bureaucrats discuss unconfirmed agitation from Polish, Czech and Jewish organizations, all sending the same message: systematic sterilization underway across the Reich and its puppet territories. But with war at its tipping point, officials hesitate. They pool the rumors with tales of soap factories, blood transfusions, and underground resistance, all labeled possible atrocity propaganda. Reports are routed into files labeled pending, their covers annotated with a single word: abgelehnt, dismissed. For investigators like John Collier at British intelligence, the scale beggars belief. It would require the complicity of doctors from Danzig to Baden, from Vienna to Strasbourg, he observes. No regime could run such a program in plain sight. German eugenics, after all, had long been whispered about. Forced race hygiene laws, the 1933 Law for Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, sterilization courts, but mass sterilization as a weapon of occupation? The notion seems too monstrous even for Berlin, yet scattered across occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Reich borderlands, survivors speak quietly of vanished sisters, mothers rendered barren, children adopted out to German families after their parents are disqualified for future generations. They report surgeries performed at night, in requisitioned hospitals and repurposed school infirmaries, with lists updated each morning by bored clerks and ambitious doctors. Sometimes only the faintest blue tattoo on an arm remains, proof of Zed for zwangssterilisiert, forcibly sterilized, stamped in bureaucracy's ink. Rumors echo through resistance channels, encoded in the knitting patterns of Polish grandmothers and hidden in the medical regimens of Theresienstadt. A young sterile survivor, Eva, escapes to Sweden and delivers an account to a Quaker diplomat. Her testimony one of hundreds that will spend years collecting dust in archives, stamped unsubstantiated by field agents. Inside Germany and Austria, leading physicians attend politely to the requests of Berlin's eugenics directors. Files from UFA-filmed sterilization science camps circulate. Clinics in Nuremberg, Kiel, and Vienna begin monthly staff reviews with meticulously typed statistics. Procedures performed, 1,287. Complications, 58. Demises, 17. Recommended dossiers for resettlement, 39. To the SS's bureaucratic mind, every birth averted is both proof of the Reich's racial engineering and an invisible act of war on hereditary inferiors. These numbers will soon surface in 1,000 tribunal documents, names reduced to margins, pain rendered statistical. Meanwhile, authorized Nazi doctors like Karl Klauberg, Horst Schumann, and Hermann Stieve correspond, sending findings to Himmler's research division. They acquire imported X-ray machines and produce thousands of bilateral failures. In Block 10 at Auschwitz, teenage girls awaken to anesthesia, only to discover after a week that feeling and fertility will never return. Some resist, hiding symptoms, falsifying fevers, attempting to escape diagnosis. Few succeed. The fantasy of precision is everywhere. By 1944, the Reich claims more than 400,000 completed sterilizations under law, before even counting hidden mass operations and ad hoc mutilations in camps. Special orderlies carry code books that catalog methods: injection sterilization, rapid; X-ray method, 3 sessions; surgical hospital transfer. The science is brutal, iterative, and experimental, each procedure feeding a regime that refines mass suffering into research, and research into denial. In London and Washington, officials debate what to do with the data as rumors persist. If this is true, one allied legal advisor writes in a confidential memo, every rule of science and war has been shattered. But if it isn't, Are we becoming the very propagandists we are sworn to fight? What none realize is the code that within a year will turn these rumors into convictions. The mechanisms of denial, the rubber stamps, the missing memos, the casual bureaucratic cruelty, will all be forced into the light. In the final months of the war, the Allies and the Soviets will find proof in the unlikeliest places. Surgeons' ledgers hidden under floorboards, X-ray equipment tagged with SS procurement stamps, and within the testimony of the very doctors who moved from respected university chairs to the dock at Nuremberg. But in 1944, in the offices, embassies, and Red Cross attics, almost no one can see what's coming. Because for every rumor dismissed, a new file is opened, and with it, the silent transformation of medical denial into the world's most damning evidence. In a cramped flat in Stockholm, 1944, Anna Kowalska, barely 18, clutches the scar where her fertility was stolen a year before in Auschwitz Block 10. Her words, carefully translated and transcribed by a Norwegian resistance volunteer, describe a routine far from the monstrous caricatures of wartime propaganda. They told us only that we were there to be examined, Anna recalls. But we quickly learned to fear the doctors' white coats more than the guards' guns. Anna is not alone. Across Sweden, Switzerland, and the embattled borderlands of Czechoslovakia, a quiet network of priests, nurses, and diplomats gathers the stories that officials in Allied capitals are still dismissing as rumors. They hear chilling echoes, clinics commandeered for special measures, X-ray machines powered up at midnight, women and men, Jewish, Polish, Sinti, Roma, asocials, and the disabled taken in healthy, returned as unfit for future life, smuggled out in diplomatic pouches. These accounts join coded letters from resistance medics, series of unexplained sterility, adolescents vanishing after visits to regional health stations, orders signed by regional SS health authorities. For Nazi administrators, the science is all about efficiency. The path from ideology to operating table is shockingly short. Early 1930s. Nazi jurists codify racial hygiene, making sterilization a state prerogative. By 1936, their courts process over 30,000 eugenics cases annually. By war's outbreak, Heinrich Himmler and other SS leaders see more. Mass sterilization as population policy, weaponized not just for the future of the Volk, but as silent genocide against entire undesirable groups. The doctors at the heart of the machinery, Karl Klauberg, Horst Schumann, Hermann Steve, and others, peddle themselves as visionaries, proposing methods to Himmler and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in polite scientific German. Klauberg experiments on hundreds of women in Block 10 at Auschwitz, injecting caustic chemicals into fallopian tubes for rapid, scalable infertility. Schumann refines X-ray techniques at Auschwitz and later Gusen, Mauthausen, focusing on reducing treatment time to minimize labor disruption in the camps. In occupied Poland and the Reich East, local hospitals are forced into compliance. Polish nurse Maria Nowak recalls, "It was like an assembly line. Once-a-week convoys, always the same faces going in, but not the same spirits coming out. Medical records interspersed with numbers, birth dates, and the fateful Z track victims as units, not patients. As procedures fail or cause infections, doctors simply switch methods and continue. The regime rewards iteration, not care. Every innovation is another line in a career-making publication. Official statistics betray chilling ambitions. The 1943 report of the Reich Main Security Office estimates at least 400,000 effective sterilizations under state law. Additional measures ongoing in camp and resettlement territories. Himmler instructs doctors, find a method to sterilize 1,000 persons in a single day, without specialized surgeons and with absolute deniability. Protocols emerge for quick, mass application X-ray sterilization, the Schumann method used in Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and resettlement centers in the Polish General Government Zone. Despite the sprawling bureaucracy, improvisation and speed often trump planning. Allied air raids delay new equipment, so doctors improvise with chemical agents, crude surgical tools, and forced labor. Survivors describe half-trained orderlies performing injections, the whisper of a German phrase, schneller, schneller, and the curtain of pain and dread that follows. Most horrifying is the regime's clinical detachment. Correspondence between Dr. Clauberg and SS leaders reveals aspirations to market non-surgical sterilization as a boon to international population control. If these methods prove viable, the Reich may benefit post-war from licensing and patents. The scale is dizzying, ambition unrestrained, and when procedures go wrong, the system consumes its own failures with chilling efficiency. Prisoners left with life-threatening infection, internal bleeding, or deformity simply disappear, recorded as natural causes or transfer to refining facility. Documentation is key. Sterilization is not an atrocity, but a technical achievement in Nazi files. Back in Sweden, Anna's account is joined by dozens more, clandestine, cross-referenced, delivered with trembling hands at neutral embassies. They form a stark contrast to the language of science and efficiency found in the German reports that in 1945 begin to spill from burning hospitals and administrative offices across the collapsing Reich. These smuggled testimonies, fused with captured Nazi files and interrogation confessions, will soon become the pillars of an unprecedented courtroom drama, the confrontation between institutional denial, medical progress, and the most fundamental values of human dignity. For now, they remain the voices that almost no one in London, Washington, or Geneva is willing to believe. But every atrocity denied only multiplies the evidence, waiting for the moment when silence breaks and history is finally forcefully rewritten. Spring, 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing in fire and retreat, leaving behind heaps of burned documents and half-buried secrets in every liberated city. But on the outskirts of German towns, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, and Gross-Rosen, a different truth endures. Basements, storage closets, and hospital wings, left behind in panic, overflowing with records, ledgers, surgical equipment, and X-ray machines bearing SS serials. The first Allied medical teams, led by American, British, and Soviet doctors, are overwhelmed. They come expecting diseases, hunger, mass graves. What they discover instead is an avalanche of science weaponized against humanity. Surgical logs coded unerwünscht, undesirable, sterilization protocols with hundreds of check marks, detailed charts comparing success and complication rates across ethnicities and age groups, supply requisitions for caustic chemicals and radio-opaque dyes, correspondence from elite university clinics. Red Cross forensic specialists, initially uncertain, even suspicious they are witnessing exaggeration, photograph sterilization tools, operating tables, and stacks of discharge summaries where every prognosis is permanent infertility. In British Army intelligence reports, officers note the high degree of order even in chaos, bodies tagged, files cross-indexed, mass sterilization reduced to statistics. Meanwhile, survivors step forward, sometimes carried by others, to testify. In Bergen-Belsen, a Polish nurse named Christina reveals a hidden logbook, names written in pencil alongside doses and dates. In Theresienstadt, Czech doctors unearth proof, order forms for X-ray tubes marked for special purposes, authorized by Berlin and distributed across the occupied zone. French teams at Natzweiler discover surgical scars and gynecological notes inside the clothing of deported girls, hastily hidden during roll calls. In the months following VE Day, as the scale of Nazi crimes becomes clear, Allied governments face their own moment of reckoning. In Washington, British and French embassies, cables cross the Atlantic stamped priority sterilization evidence. The atmosphere changes. Doubt turns to dread as OSS analysts compare rumors once discarded as propaganda with crushing evidence from liberated camps. Every signature, every stamp, every line on the master lists matches survivor testimony, point for horrifying point. The first internal summary, compiled for the United Nations War Crimes Commission, is blunt. Systematic sterilization performed across the Reich and occupied territories. Number of victims likely exceeds 400,000 official. Probable total, including unrecorded camp procedures, unknown but substantial. With the hunt for architects intensifying, former SS doctors are rounded up. Some confess under interrogation, others attempt suicide, and a few, like Clauberg and Schumann, flee, only to be extradited and returned to face justice. Medical officers at Nuremberg are stunned by the clinical detachment that remains. It was not murder, but intervention. Not a crime, but a national policy, insists one defendant, holding aloft a Reich ministry order. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial, 1946-47, prosecutors unveil the mountain of evidence. Eyewitness after eyewitness describes the assembly line sterilizations. Prisoners marched unclothed into X-ray chambers. Lines of teenage girls and women immobilized for injections. The unflinching efficiency of German record-keeping. Courtroom testimony is supported with hundreds of ledgers, discharge records, voluntary consent forms forged or absent. For the first time, jurists and legal scholars worldwide hear the phrase, crimes against humanity, defined not merely by atrocity, but by bureaucracy. The defendant's defense, acting under orders, medical progress, race hygiene as collapses under cross-examination. Sample documents presented by the Allies show coordinated, cross-departmental participation. University chairs, county physicians, and SS directors all bound by the language of scientific legitimacy and state necessity. The judges, faced not just with piles of evidence, but with the living bodies of survivors, move beyond individual guilt. They indict a culture, medical schools, licensing boards, even scientific journals that once published glowing reports of breakthroughs in mass sterilization now stand in judgment. Survivors speak their truth, describing how denial, apathy, and rationalization gave surgeons the cover to innovate pain. The verdict is a warning, not merely a punishment. The voluntary consent of the human subject is essential, reads the foundation stone of the Nuremberg Code. Science divorced from conscience is not progress, but regression. Medicine subjugated to the state becomes not healing, but harm. As headlines around the world trumpet the code, a new era begins. But for the survivors and the doctors now facing execution or life imprisonment, the names in the ledgers, once ignored, become their judge and legacy. What the Allies called rumor is finally proven, not just in memory but in law. The world will never again claim ignorance as excuse. As the Nuremberg doctors' trial verdicts echoed around the world in 1947, a new era quietly began. The code's chilling first point, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, spread rapidly, not as hope, but as a warning writ into law and policy. But the world's encounter with mass sterilization did not resolve with the clang of the gavel. Instead, it launched a wave of inquiry, reform, and activism that would unfold for generations, testing the resolve of medicine, science, and society to uphold what was learned at so grave a cost. In West Germany, medical schools purged Nazi-era professors from rosters only to reinstate many quietly a decade later. Journals issued retractions for studies written by Klauberg, Schumann, and their acolytes. But new researchers often cited the same methods under the rubric of efficiency. Some in academic circles whispered that the scale of Nazi sterilization, a blend of race science, totalitarian control, and bureaucratic zeal, was unique, unrepeatable. Others saw the same rationalizations reappearing everywhere, in the body treatment of the disabled, of the poor, of marginalized people from Mississippi hospitals to Canadian residential schools. The world reeled as new horrors came to light. In the 1950s, scandals erupted as patients in state asylums and prisoners in the US and Britain discovered they'd been sterilized without true consent, the policies rationalized as modern eugenics. In Sweden and Switzerland, state-run sterilizations of the unfit, Roma Sami orphans, continued into the 1970s, shielded by bureaucratic doublespeak and medical authority. Even in the 21st century, family planning programs from Peru to Uzbekistan faced charges of coercion, always citing science, always ignoring voices of the vulnerable. But the rise of the Nuremberg Code, combined with survivor testimony, created a new breed of watchdog. In Paris, survivor and medical ethicist Gisèle Perrault helped establish Europe's first independent research oversight committees, demanding lay voices on every panel. In the United States, the shocking revelation of the Tuskegee syphilis study, hundreds left untreated for decades by government doctors, ignited congressional hearings where the code was invoked with anger, reverence, and shame. Activists declared, "Never again will we accept the excuse that damage was done for science." Institutions changed, sometimes grudgingly. By 1964, the World Medical Association adopted the Declaration of Helsinki, expanding the code's principles and insisting research could never override consent. Hospitals worldwide established IRBs and patient charters, often literally displaying the 10 points of the Nuremberg Code in research corridors. In Japan, Brazil, South Africa, and Israel, legal reforms matched Nuremberg language word for word, placing stories of Nazi victims into legal precedent. Meanwhile, survivors of Nazi mass sterilization, once shunned or forgotten, became international witnesses. Traveling from Polish villages to United Nations forums, they told of bodies branded by bureaucracy, of children never conceived, of silence imposed by shame and stigma. Memorials in Berlin, Vienna, and Warsaw featured rows of empty cradles, a visual reminder of the lost generations. At annual Nuremberg Code vigils, survivors, physicians, and students read the names of victims aloud, asking, which voices remain unseen even now? Yet despite these reforms, memory proved a fragile shield. In the 1990s, the rise of Holocaust, denial and scientific revisionism, on the fringes of academia and in dark recesses online, challenged even photographic evidence, ledgers, or survivor scars. Some called these experiments alleged. Others claimed they were exaggerated or justified by wartime chaos. Each time denial resurfaced, international coalitions of historians, survivors, and doctors leapt into action, publishing newly digitized ledgers, restoring neglected memorials, and calling out silence wherever it crept into medical or legal debate. The numbers tell part of the legacy. Over 400,000 victims officially sterilized under Nazi policy. Countless more unrecorded or lost in the gray zone of occupation and ethnic cleansing. Nuremberg Code principles now referenced in the constitutions or health laws of more than 100 countries. At least 37 formal government apologies and reparations issued to victims of medical abuse worldwide, each citing Nuremberg as a turning point. But the heart of the legacy lies in vigilance, the quiet defiance of records kept, lawsuits filed, stories told, each a rebuke to the bureaucracy of forgetting. In classrooms from Tokyo to Cape Town, students debate the code, tracing every debate on research privacy and bodily autonomy back to testimony taken from Block 10, Auschwitz, or the shadowed corridors of city sterilization wards. Every time a new scientific breakthrough courts ethical gray zones, CRISPR babies, human cloning, population policy debates, journalists, ethicists, and campaigners invoke Ravensbrück, sterilization, and the Nuremberg Code. Will you ignore the warning, they ask, or heed the evidence that once changed the world? The story of Allied denial and Nazi sterilization is not history past, but a mirror and an alarm bell, demanding to know whether society today is any more willing to face what officialdom once called impossible. In January 1948, just months after the Nuremberg sentences, the Nazi doctors' registry was closed and thousands of classified files were boxed for storage. For public record, the world watched as justice descended. 7 men and 1 woman executed, dozens sentenced, the remainder forever excluded from respectable science. But the mass sterilization story, its shadow and silence, refused to end with the tribunals. Many perpetrators disappeared into post-war society under assumed names, sometimes slipping into academia in the new German states or Austria. In East Germany, some were quietly employed by Soviet bio-research units. In the West, others found work in universities and clinics, desperate to resurrect a shattered medical system. Only a handful of the 350-plus sterilization technicians and experimenters stood in the Nuremberg courtroom. Outside the spotlight, local trials sputtered, files lost, witnesses intimidated, statutes of limitation expired. Journalistic exposés in the 1950s and 60s revealed German population specialists working on tropical medicine in Africa and South America, raising uncomfortable questions about the afterlife of Nazi eugenics. But the collective reckoning wasn't limited to Germany. In Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, and the United States, victims came forward only to find systems reluctant to acknowledge their pain. In Sweden, state sterilizations continued under a welfare modernity banner into the 1970s, often targeting Roma, the disabled, indigenous Sami, and the poor. U.S. states implemented and expanded eugenic sterilization well into the civil rights era, with North Carolina performing nearly 7,600 procedures after 1945. The legacy of science for the greater good, shadowing lines written at Nuremberg. Personal stories from victims begin to surface. In Krakow, Maria Lisowska sued for damages in 1954, representing not merely herself, but the invisible ranks of administrative medical victims. Her lawsuit was dismissed. Judges cited lack of documentation. Most files had been destroyed during the Nazis' retreat. In Canada, survivors of forced sterilizations at Alberta mental hospitals reached out, first in private memoirs, then in class action suits, as whispers of "it can't happen here" eroded with court-proven facts. Through the 1950s and 60s, popular magazines featured survivor interviews. Some described being handed a form in an unfamiliar language, told only, "This is necessary for your freedom," then waking, bleeding, in a room of silent beds. Others, like the Sinti woman Gerda Lang, escaped a camp only to discover years later why pregnancy never came. "My real crime was my last name and my grandmother's accent," she said. Her words later read aloud in the Bundestag during reparations debates. Yet for every story that pierced the public conscience, dozens remained buried by family shame, community fear, and the chilling legacy of medical authority. Many survivors suppressed their histories, raising children or adopting when they could, reconstructing identity in countries that viewed the sterilized as embarrassing evidence of both totalitarianism past and democratic failure present. Cultural confrontation grew gradually. In the 1970s, German television aired docudramas about Nazi sterilization programs, sparking protest and calls for compensation. Polish and French directors crafted grim cinematic portraits of hospital corridors and whispered betrayals. Novels, radio dramas, and educational campaigns in Norway, Sweden, and Canada used historical fiction to force new generations to question the boundaries of consent, trust, and expertise. Meanwhile, in medical schools across Europe and North America, Nuremberg's shadow lengthened as students demanded transparency about professors' wartime and post-war affiliations. Whistleblowers published lists of past collaborators and exposed scientists with Nazi pasts authoring textbooks used in public health. The medical code was now more than a law. It was a battleground. Each debate over genetics, family planning, and disability policy echoed with refrains of "never again." And as the Cold War intensified, new powers repackaged lessons from Nazi sterilization for their own ends. Soviet biopolitics invoked Nuremberg when denouncing Western practices, while at home, they pursued forced institutionalization and secret medical trials. American public health leaders cited the code in drafting IRB regulations, even as they fought lawsuits from surviving victims of eugenic sterilization. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, history remained an active wound, reopened with every new scandal, from the Guatemala syphilis experiments, to French hospital abuses, to Japanese post-war relocation surgeries. By the millennium's turn, the mass sterilization story had been claimed by survivor advocacy, legal precedent, art, and activism, but also by deniers and apologists. The story's power, its click-worthiness, and gravity lay not only in numbers or even the infamous names. It was in the silent army of survivors who remade themselves despite science gone astray, who forced the world to see that for every efficiency or solution in state policy, there was a torn family, a single lost future, and a voice that had once been denied. The reckoning remains unfinished. Because even into the 21st century, the questions raised by Block 10 and every tribunal after Nuremberg are asked anew in every research ethics committee, every patient consent form, and every debate over medicine's power or powerlessness to say no. As the digital age dawned, the Nuremberg Code faced tests that even its creators could scarcely imagine. The end of the 20th century brought medical miracles and fresh ethical perils. Gene editing, organ transplants, global pandemics, social media data harvesting, CRISPR, and AI, each promising progress and each shadowed by the very abuses the code had condemned. Again and again, scandals erupted, reminding the world of the fine line between innovation and atrocity. In the 1990s, revelations surfaced of pharmaceutical giants conducting clinical drug trials on African, Indian, and Latin American populations, often without full informed consent or transparency. Journalists and survivors pointed to the code, insisting that the rush for a cure never meant rights could be ignored. Genetic technologies boomed, and with them, fears of neo-eugenics. Could embryo selection and gene modification in wealthy nations revive the very logic of prevention of the unfit, once coded by Nazi science? In the United States, survivors of post-war eugenics and indigenous population sterilization programs finally won class action victories. Testimony in Congress echoed language from Nuremberg. Consent is not a privilege, it is the core of what makes medicine ethical. International organizations tried to keep pace. The World Health Organization and UNESCO issued declarations: Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, Guidelines for Ethical Research, each renewing the Nuremberg Code's core, but with added layers for digital privacy, genetic data, and cross-border research. But even as the legacy spread, cracks appeared. In state of emergency responses to epidemics HIV, SARS, Ebola, COVID-19, pressure mounted. Could governments override consent to fight the greater harm? Each time, debate raged. Did the stakes justify selective paternalism? Should public interest ever silence individual choice? And in some nations, autocratic regimes recycled the Reich's own playbook, albeit in modern guise: coercive family planning, forced sterilizations of minorities and political prisoners, and targeting whole communities as biological threats. Insurers and health tech companies quietly skirted the Nuremberg Code, opting for opt-out policies and algorithmic experimentation. In these storms, an unexpected force rose: global networks of advocates, survivors, medical students, journalists, and citizen scientists. Organized online and across borders, they used the code, its text, its origin stories, its martyr witnesses, to challenge, expose, and shame violators. Unique museum exhibitions opened in Shanghai, Buenos Aires, Toronto, and Lagos, adapting the lessons for local legend and current crisis, always featuring interfaces to digitally sign, recite, or personalize the code for visitors. Grassroots projects chronicled fresh abuses: forced sterilizations in Xinjiang, unauthorized clinical trials in Malawi, vaccine scapegoating in marginalized communities, each traced back to a refusal to see, listen, and believe. The refrain echoed from boardrooms to protest lines: if you ignore the Nuremberg Code, history repeats itself, not as nightmare, but as policy. Numbers and stories kept passing through the generations. By the 2020s, more than 160 countries referenced voluntary consent in medical codes. In 2021, students in Berlin hacked a VR video game to highlight bioethics violations. In response, the city council added a QR code Nuremberg Code checkpoint to every new research center. Disability, patient, and reproductive rights groups wove the code's language into court decisions, challenging malpractice, guardianships, and hospital violence. All the while, survivors' children, sometimes the only living links to Nazi sterilization victims, published new research, launched podcasts, and lobbied for consent literacy in school curricula. As scientific revolutions accelerate, the Nuremberg Code stands paradoxically both historic relic and urgent tool. It is quoted, doubted, appropriated, and reinterpreted, yet at every inflection point, one line remains clear: to dismiss the first warning is to invite the second wound. Bureaucratic indifference and ethical shortcuts, however rationalized, always risk returning us to the path that began in the blind alleys of denial. Hospitals and universities in modern Europe bear little resemblance to the gray, institutional corridors that ran through Nazi Germany's eugenic machine, or so it seems at first glance. But in the midnight quiet of research libraries and archive basements, another world flickers. Shelves of dossiers, ledgers unopened for decades, cardboard boxes marked restricted or Lichtbildnis and not Aushändigen. Inside, affidavits, x-rays, tattoo registers, scraps of hair and blood on old glass slides, and, most haunting, page after page of names that were not supposed to survive. It is here, decades after the Nuremberg Code was carved into law, that a new generation uncovers the real meaning of legacy. not as abstract principle, but as faces, voices, and choices. Interviews with those who fought for post-war justice reveal both triumph and exhaustion. Lieselotte Klein's granddaughter, now a medical ethics professor, finds in her family's home a faded document, a forced consent form with boxes for race, background, social productivity. On the back, her grandmother's secret note, "Let this never belong to your hands." In Poland, researchers digitize 40,000 previously unarchived medical files from the war's edge, reading and entering facts for weeks until they weep from the accumulated gravity, each record a genocide compressed to 2 lines and a date. The reckoning does not stop at paperwork. For many years, government-sponsored projects attempt to compensate or restore families lost in the whirlwind of Nazi and post-war eugenics. Some officials speak with remorse, others with the mechanical chill of duty. In Sweden, the Prime Minister apologizes in 1997 for a half-century of forced sterilizations, offering restitution and public memorials. In Germany, the Bundestag debates for decades how to honor victims whose very existence the Third Reich declared life unworthy of life. In the United States, indigenous tribes and black communities push courts and legislatures to force open the ledgers, demanding not only apologies but amends. Survivor narratives remain the sharpest blade against erasure. In oral histories, each voice becomes a pinprick in the vast map of 20th century denial. Sabine, sterilized at age 17 in Ravensbrück, recalls how she and her friends created a code to demand accountability of future doctors, tucked their fingers behind their back in medical wards to signal they had not consented, an invisible protest, handed from one patient to the next. At an annual commemoration in Berlin, the grandchildren of victims speak for those silenced. For every line written about my grandmother's so-called deficiency, my family plants a tree on our street. We want Berlin to remember she lived, not just suffered. My father was marked as incorrigible because at 8 he ran away from orphanage labor. I run marathons and wear his prisoner number. His loss is not just history but body and breath in me. The arts amplify memory's reach. Installations at the Ravensbrück Memorial invite visitors to recite the Nuremberg Code out loud. Recordings echo through the former cell blocks, overlapping with the names of sterilized victims. Musicians compose requiems setting survivor testimony to violins and low choir, performed on the anniversaries of liberation. Novels and graphic novels translated into dozens of languages fictionalize the fate of a single folder, a single girl. A single family path vanished. The stories not as statistics but as living, shattering counterarguments to denial. Legal cases ripple through the continents. Over 7 decades, more than 60 countries face class action lawsuits from sterilization victims or their heirs. Some, like Canada and Norway, end with landmark settlements and the creation of permanent public registries. Others, Hungary, Romania, parts of the United States, stall for years, haunted by lost records, hostile governments, or social stigma. Reparations, where granted, can never give back what was taken. The possibility of descendants, the right to choose family, or the dignity of bodily autonomy. Yet every court decision affirms what the Allies ignored. To refuse to investigate is itself a crime. To dismiss warning for rumor is to become complicit, not neutral. Meanwhile, science and medicine lurch forward. Each decade, new lines are drawn in the sand. Debates over prenatal testing, gene drives, designer embryos, and the looming threat of AI medical oversight force bioethics boards to return, again and again, to Nuremberg's first question. What is consent? And who defines it for those who cannot speak? Military and intelligence communities, experimenting with enhancement technologies, brush up against the code's warning about the state's temptation to own the bodies of its citizens. Now, thousands of university courses and professional oaths worldwide recite the Nuremberg Code. But survivors and their advocates know vigilance fades as memory dims. Whistleblowers from modern clinical trials, India, Africa, Latin America, cite Nazi files to warn of shadowed volunteers, emphasizing that consent lost in translation or coerced by desperation is no better than silence imposed by fear. At the same time, rogue doctors and pseudoscientific cults invoke jargon and urgency, mirroring the bureaucratic doublespeak of the Reich to justify speed and secrecy. Online, denialists spread disinformation, sometimes exploiting the trauma of survivors to mask political aims. Vigils and protests answer every breach of the code. In Johannesburg, Paris, Seoul, São Paulo, and Phoenix, activists carry portraits of known victims, reading the declarations of Helsinki, Belmont, and always Nuremberg. At United Nations summits and local government meetings, the question returns: if this were happening again, would we see it? Would we act? The numbers grow. By 2025, more than 33 national governments have issued formal reports or apologies for past sterilization crimes. Legal translation of the Nuremberg Code appears in 80+ countries. Worldwide, memorials for victims of eugenic forced sterilization welcome millions of visitors. Their school visits, digital exhibits, and social campaigns drive a new consent literacy, as potent as any law. Social media platforms struggle to combat both denial and the exploitation of survivor stories. Hashtags like "Count Our Right to Belong," "God Never Again Silence," and "The Coda Demands" it become rallying points for new generations. In the closing moments, the documentary returns to the site of so much pain, the operating rooms and barracks of camps and clinics where the silence once ruled. But instead of quiet, there is music and reading. Survivors' names are projected in digital light, accompanied by the refrain, "We were denied, so you must remember. We were dismissed, so you must demand." The camera lingers on a teenager in a white lab coat, reciting the code's first article in French. The refrain passes to an elderly Roma activist in Bucharest, then an Afro-Brazilian nurse in the Amazon, and a Lakota descendant in Minnesota. Their voices merge, blending sorrow and insistence. Consent is not a favor, but a right. Denial is not an accident, but a choice. Every warning ignored is a future lost. As the credits roll, the final spoken line, channeling the original spirit of WWW2 tales and reflecting all you have built, challenges every viewer. If those in power had listened when the first warning sounded, how many lives would have been saved? The code remains, the stories burn, the ledger lengthens. Your vigilance, today, tomorrow, and always, writes the next entry in the endless ledger of history.